Ever feel like you're walking into a meeting and everyone's speaking a different language?
Yeah.
Like throwing around terms like GDP growth,
Yeah.
making predictions about the economy,
Yeah.
and you're nodding along, trying to look informed, but secretly you're like, man, I wish I paid more attention in Econ 101.
It's like you need a decoder ring sometimes
Exactly.
just to understand the business section. Right.
Which is why today we are doing a deep dive into one of those terms that gets thrown around like everyone already gets it.
Right.
GDP.
And believe me, even if you think you know GDP,
Yeah.
there's always more to uncover. We're going behind the scenes, and we're using this IMF Finance and Development article called Gross Domestic Product, an Economy's All.
Seriously, they weren't kidding with that title.
It really is.
They really weren't.
Trying to capture everything, really.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
let's start with the basics. What is GDP?
So at its very core, GDP is a measure of a country's economic activity. And it's measured by the total monetary value of all the final goods and services produced within a country's borders
Okay.
in a given period, typically a year. So it's like a giant calculator adding up everything that's bought and sold.
Okay, so it's not just about how much stuff is produced, though, right? It's also about the value of that stuff.
Exactly.
Like a high-end smartphone contributes more to the GDP than like a pack of gum, even though they're both...
Precisely. It's about the market value of what's produced. But here's where it gets interesting. So GDP isn't just tracking iPhones and chewing gum. It also includes things that aren't sold in the traditional sense, like government services.
Right, like public education or the fire department.
Exactly.
We don't buy those services directly, but they're still essential parts of the economy.
Absolutely.
So that kind of brings up another question, though. If GDP is trying to measure everything, what doesn't it measure? What's falling through the cracks?
That's a crucial question, because what GDP doesn't measure is often as important as what it does. For instance, one major thing it overlooks is unpaid work, like household chores or volunteer work.
Ah, so that's why my amazing homemade sourdough bread hasn't made me a captain of industry.
There you go.
All those hours kneading dough, completely invisible to the GDP, which honestly feels a little unfair, don't you think?
It does highlight a real issue where a lot of work and essential work, a lot of times done by women, is invisible to these traditional economic measures. And it's not just housework, right? Think about stay-at-home parents, caregivers. They're making huge contributions.
Yeah, absolutely.
But those aren't accounted for in GDP.
Yeah, it seems like we're only seeing part of the picture if we're not factoring that in. What else is missing?
Another significant factor that GDP doesn't fully capture is depreciation.
Depreciation. Is that like when my car loses value the second I drive off the lot?
Well, you're on the right track. In economic terms, depreciation refers to the wear and tear on machinery, equipment, and buildings used in the production process. These assets have a lifespan, and their value diminishes over time as they are used.
So it's like a factory using its machinery until it eventually needs to be replaced.
Exactly. And while GDP accounts for the initial investment in that machinery, it doesn't fully reflect the ongoing cost of that depreciation. It's like assuming a delivery truck will last forever, even with constant use.
It's like we're trying to understand a person by just looking at their bank statement.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Gives you some insights, but it doesn't tell you everything about their life or their values or anything like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of values, our article dives into this thing called real GDP. Is that about getting to the heart of that?
It's about getting a clearer picture, I'd say.
Okay.
So you see, when we talk about GDP, we need to be careful about, are we talking about nominal GDP or are we talking about real GDP?
Okay, I'm sensing an important distinction here.
Here is.
Break it down for me.
All right. So nominal GDP, that's like looking at the economy through a magnifying glass. But the magnifying glass changes size every year.
Okay.
It reflects the prices that are happening now.
Right.
But of course, those can be distorted by inflation.
Ah, inflation. That thing that makes everything seem more expensive over time, even if we're not actually producing more stuff.
Exactly. That's it. So if a cup of coffee, the price doubles because of inflation, nominal GDP would say, oh, the coffee industry is twice as big as it was last year.
Right.
Even if people are drinking the same amount of coffee.
Yeah, it's misleading.
Totally.
So how do we adjust for that?
That's where real GDP comes in.
Okay.
It factors out the impact of inflation. So it gives us a way to measure Are we actually producing more?
Right.
Or is it just this illusion because of inflation? It's like we're comparing things with a measuring stick that stays the same length year after year.
Okay, so it helps us see if the economy is actually growing or if it's just that inflation illusion.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. But this whole measuring thing got me thinking. How do we actually calculate GDP? It's not like we can weigh a country's economic output on a giant scale, right?
That would be something, wouldn't it?
Right.
Fortunately, economists have a few different ways.
Okay.
Three, in fact.
Okay.
Three main approaches to calculate GDP.
All right.
The production approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach.
Okay.
Think of them as three different paths, all leading to the same destination.
All right. I like that analogy. Guide me down these paths.
Okay, so let's say we're using the example of building a house just to illustrate.
Okay.
The production approach, that looks at the value added at each stage of the process.
Okay.
So we think about, okay, the lumber mill, how much value did they add by processing the wood? Then the contractor, how much value did they add by actually taking that wood and turning it into a house?
So we're adding up the value created at each step of the way.
Exactly. Now, expenditure, that's coming at it from the buyer's perspective.
Yep.
So what did the homeowner spend to buy that house? Were there any loans involved? That kind of thing.
So it's about who paid what to bring this house into existence.
Exactly.
Okay. What about income then?
So the income approach, that focuses on all the income that's earned through this whole process. The wages of the workers, the profits of that contractor, were any taxes collected.
Okay. So whether we're tracing the value added, the money spent, or the income earned, we should theoretically arrive at the same GDP figure.
Ideally. Exactly.
Okay.
That's the beauty of the system.
Yeah.
In theory, while there might be slight statistical differences, they should all kind of converge on the same number.
Okay. That's reassuring. Sounds like economists have really put some thought into this whole measuring thing.
They have, yeah.
But let's get real here for a second.
Okay.
Why should the average person listening to this even care about GDP? Like, what does this actually tell us about how the economy is impacting their everyday life?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, GDP growth, or the lack of it, it has a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Okay.
And that ripple, it reaches all of us.
So when GDP is up, things are generally good, but when it's down, batten down the hatches.
Basically, yeah. When you see a growing GDP, more jobs are being created, businesses feel more confident, they're investing, they're expanding, more money is flowing through the economy. That can lead to higher wages, people are spending more. There's this sense of optimism, right?
Yeah, it's like a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say.
To a certain extent, yeah. However, we also have to remember that not everyone benefits equally from GDP growth. But we'll get into that.
Right. Okay. So we've got this number. GDP gives us a sense of how the economy is doing overall, but it doesn't tell us everything. It's kind of like a health checkup that only measures your height and your weight.
Yeah,
Like helpful, but doesn't really tell you if you're actually healthy.
exactly. And that brings us to some of the limitations of using GDP as this be-all and end-all measure of economic progress.
Right. So if GDP is like a health checkup that only checks your height and weight, what other vital signs are we missing here? What else should be on the checkup?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, right? Because while GDP measures that economic output, it doesn't really tell us that much about the quality of life inside a country.
Okay.
You know, it's like judging a meal solely on how much it weighs. You're missing out on flavor, nutrition. You know, do people even enjoy it?
Yeah. A country could have like a sky-high GDP, but still have tons of poverty, inequality, or even just people being unhappy.
For sure. GDP doesn't differentiate between good growth and bad growth.
Right.
Like cleaning up an oil spill is treated the same as producing the oil in the first place.
Wow, that seems like a pretty significant oversight. Are there other ways to kind of measure a country's progress that take those things into account?
There are. One that's really well known is the UN's Human Development Index. You've probably heard of that.
Yeah, big crowd.
Instead of just income, it looks at things like how long are people living? What are the education levels? What's the standard of living really like?
It's like saying, okay, you have money, but are you living a good life, a long life?
Exactly. And it paints quite a different picture than GDP alone.
Okay.
You know, some countries with
Yeah.
relatively high GDP have surprisingly low HDI rankings because of things like inequality or lack of access to healthcare.
So it's like a reality check on those GDP numbers.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, cool. Are there other measures, like are there any that go beyond just economics and try to assess like overall well-being?
Yeah, there are a few. One you might find interesting is it was developed in the country of Bhutan. It's called the Gross National Happiness Index.
Okay. I've heard of this, yeah.
It measures things like psychological well-being,
Hmm.
community vitality, environmental conservation.
It's like they're saying, hey, maybe economic growth isn't the only path to happiness.
Yeah, and it might be onto something.
Right. Okay, so these alternative measures, they're not perfect, obviously, but they do highlight this need to kind of take a more holistic view, right?
Yeah,
One that considers people and the planet
absolutely.
alongside those economic indicators.
It's not just about how much money's sloshing around, but how are we using that money?
Exact.
And is it actually leading to better lives for people?
Okay, and that actually brings us to another important thing about GDP, and it's using it to compare different countries.
Right.
Because we always hear about, oh, this country's economy is so much bigger than this country's, it's growing faster.
Right.
But how do you even compare economies that use different currencies
It's tricky.
and have different costs of living?
For sure, because you can't just do a straight-up currency conversion,
Right.
because that doesn't tell you what that money can actually buy in those countries.
Like a dollar might get you a cup of coffee here, but it could buy you a whole meal somewhere else.
That's it, yeah. That's where you got to bring in this idea of purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Okay.
And what it tries to do is level the playing field a little bit. So it considers how much does a basket of goods and services actually cost in different places.
So instead of just looking at the exchange rate, we're comparing the price of like a haircut or a loaf of bread in different countries.
Exactly. So PPP helps us understand, okay, what does someone's income actually get them in their local economy? It gives you a more realistic way to compare living standards across different countries.
This has been really interesting. We've learned that GDP can be super useful for understanding economic activity, but it's not the end-all be-all.
Real.
It's important to look beyond just those numbers
For sure.
and consider what they really tell us about a country and its well-being.
Think about what's driving the growth. Who's benefiting? What other factors should we be thinking about when we're trying to assess how a country's really doing?
Right, because a thriving society, it's about more than just dollars and cents. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live that long, healthy, fulfilling life.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into the complex, fascinating world of GDP.
The whole economy.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time for another fascinating exploration.